All right. Yeah, let's get started. I did send a reminder. I know Flint said he would, want to be on, but probably people are starting late. So let's just get started. So first, just welcoming everyone. Excited to have this virtual happy hour and discussion, and we did call it a happy hour. I was hoping at least someone other than me would bring at least a drink just to take some time this evening to talk a little bit about air quality permitting and compliance for data centers. So, there's Flint.
What? I don't know. We'll talk about it later.
Oh, everything okay, Flint?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, just some housekeeping as well. During the presentation, you can keep your microphone on mute, and we can do a Q&A after. If there are any immediate questions that come up, then you can just type it in the chat box while you're thinking of the question. So feel free to use the chat box to enter any questions, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as Ali's presenting. But at the end, we can go through all the questions and have a little bit more of a discussion. So the session is being recorded right now. So at the end, we'll get the copy of Ali's presentation and the recording, and we'll post them on our website. So our website is just SAS A&WMA, Baltimore, Washington chapter. So it'll be on there. So a little bit about our speaker. Today we have Dr. Ali Farnoud, who is a good friend of mine and former manager. Ali and I worked together at Ramboll until very recently, and yeah, he's been great to work with. He's an expert in air quality, permitting, and compliance, and he's also been really active in A&WMA, both in our local chapter and nationally, in doing different presentations and webinars for A&WMA. So we're really happy to have him to come and speak to us today. So Ali can take it away. Thanks.
Sure thing. Let me share my screen. And okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right. Sounds great. So before I start, I just wanted to let everybody know that my cat will almost certainly jump in my lap at some point during the presentation, like she did just a few minutes ago. So just an FYI, we are all working from home these days, and you know how it is. But the topic, as Hannah said, is data centers, air permitting and compliance considerations, and also operational challenges that data centers face to comply with their permits. I will start just with a couple of slides about Ramboll. My goal is not marketing, just introducing our company and then myself. Ramboll is a engineering consulting firm, and we just celebrated our 75th birthday. It started in 1945 in Denmark, and now we have about 17,000 people and about 2,500 in the Americas, in the US, Canada, and also in South and Latin America, and almost entirely in environment and health. Our America presence is mostly environment and health, and I'm also in the environment and health group. This is a map of all of our offices in the US, and I am in Arlington, Virginia office, but right now working from home in Rockville, Maryland. So a little bit about myself. I've been doing air quality consulting for about 13 years. Before that, went to grad school and did some research on removing diesel particulate matter using electrostatic precipitators, and started consulting in 2008. Yesterday was my 5th anniversary with Ramboll. Currently, I have the longest title of my career, which is Senior Managing Consultant or Senior Project Manager in Ramboll's air practice. And I also serve as the Global Air Quality Subject Matter Expert for data centers. Before joining Ramboll, I was with another company called Trinity Consultants for about 8 years. Outside my professional life, My hobbies are reading, writing, cooking, photography, and also refinishing old furniture, restoring things. And the one that keeps me sane during COVID is definitely photography. So with that, thanks for listening to the introduction. I'll start with data centers. So data centers basically are where, as you can tell from the name, where the data is stored. All of the data that you put in Google, photos that you post on Instagram, search history on Amazon, they all go and get stored in data centers. And as a result, there are a lot of servers at the data centers to keep all of this data alive. And it's important to make sure that these servers will not go down, because none of this we don't want any of this information to get lost. So there are two major power consumers at a data center. One is the server itself, just to be up and running all the time. And then the second one is the chillers that are keeping the server rooms cool, to make sure that the data is safe and the servers are working properly. To make sure that the flow of electricity is not disrupted to the data center, so we get this electricity from the utility power under normal circumstances. However, the server rooms are also connected to an emergency generator in case the electricity goes out. Then if the flow of electricity gets disrupted, there will be a few minutes before the generators kick in. So during that time, the servers will be on UPS, uninterruptible power supply, and the UPSs run on lead acid batteries like the one in your car. So you will see a number of lead acid batteries in each server room. So there are a few sources of, say, emissions. One is the chillers, which include refrigerant, even though most of them are closed loops. And then you have all of the emergency generators at the data center. Since there are a lot of servers and a lot of data rooms, there are also a lot of emergency generators. And one thing that I'll say is data centers used to be fairly small. The first data center I ever visited as a consultant was, I think it was 2014 or 15, and it was a facility with only 12 generators. There are still a lot of those facilities around, but at the same time, you see a lot of data centers with 200, 300, or 400 generators. So what are the largest data center markets in the US? You can see it based on this map. The largest circle is the DC area, and specifically Northern Virginia. There are a lot of data centers located in this area, and as a result, you can, I mean, if you've lived in this area a while, you definitely can see that Ashburn has completely changed. There are also other parts of the country that's getting a lot of data centers as well. Dallas-Fort Worth being one of them. You can go outside the US. There are a lot of data centers in Europe. There are data centers now in Toronto. They are all becoming little data center hubs, but definitely the largest in the world is Northern Virginia. So I'll talk about permitting and compliance of data centers in Virginia, but I will also talk about various states and cover those as well. But here is a map of data centers in Northern Virginia. This is from a presentation that Tom Faya and Justin Wilkinson, the regional director and the air permitting manager in Northern Virginia, gave us last, I believe, November in our office. And I got this from their slides. As you can see, there are a lot of data center right now, or at least as of November of 2019, Tom said there are about 90 or 92 active permits for data centers in the area, and 8,000 megawatts of power. So there are a lot of engines, and there are also a lot of data centers in our area. Now, emergency generators, as you can see from this photo of a data center, and like I said, there is an emergency generator connected to each data room. Emergency generators are combustion sources. So as combustion sources, they have nitrogen oxides or NOx emissions, then carbon monoxide emissions, and then particulate matter, and to a lesser extent, VOCs and also SO2 and some air toxics. Air toxics in general are not a problem for combustion sources and definitely not for emergency generators, although there are some states like Georgia that require you to model them, and I will talk about that briefly. So you have all of these data centers, and because of these emissions that I talked about, they all need to be permitted, or at least the majority, depending on the state regulations. But if you think about it, the federal and state air permitting regulations are typically designed for, when it comes to emergency generators at least, they are typically designed for a large facility with one generator sitting there as an emergency unit, and not hundreds of emergency generators on site. Our regulations in general are either designed for a large cement kiln with 3,000 tons per year of SO2, or just one or two small units and not 400 different small units at a site. So that's definitely one challenge that various states that have a lot of data center attention are dealing with, and they have to kind of design their own permitting program to make sure that they keep their attainment status and they cope with the growth explosion of data centers at the same time. And also from the investor and the designer perspective, air permitting is one of the most important aspects of data center design. That is true about pretty much anything, but when it comes to data centers, it becomes very important because if, for example, you permit a data center as a major source and you have to install SCRs on 300 different engines, that is a $50–60 million investment by itself. So as a result of that, air permitting becomes really important for data centers. So let's get into some general concepts and what makes air permitting complicated for data centers, or how what items you have to consider in, first of all, for siting data centers and also for permitting them. And then after a few slides on this section, I will also get into how various states are dealing with data centers and how they permit them. So for siting considerations, the very first item to look into about where the data center is going is whether the area is in attainment or non-attainment. Data centers generate nitrogen oxides, not necessarily a lot of nitrogen oxides because there are limited hours of operation, but since there are many engines, it could still be a sizable source. And and obviously if they're in a non-attainment area or in an attainment area, they do contribute to generation of ozone, as nitrogen oxide is a precursor for ozone. And with generators, we are generally most concerned with these NOx emissions. So if you are, so the question here is, if you're in an attainment area or a non-attainment area, what is the major source threshold? If you are in an attainment area, the major source threshold before you hit major source permitting would be 250 tons per year. That's the amount of NOx emissions allowables that the state will give you to install your data center. If you go into non-attainment area, depending on the classification, if you're in marginal or moderate, you can get 100 tons per year of allowables, kind of like we are in Northern Virginia, and those are the permits that we see. A lot of different areas of the states, like Dallas-Fort Worth and Chicago, they last year in August of 2019, if I'm not mistaken, they went into serious non-attainment, so that major source threshold of 100 goes down to 50. And some of these areas, again, like Dallas-Fort Worth, are likely to go into severe non-attainment, which only gives a data center 25 tons per year to work with before they hit the major source threshold, major source permitting. So why is this important? Data centers typically would like to take limits and become a synthetic miner facility and stay below the major source threshold. because of the reason that I mentioned, that they will, if they go over the major source threshold, they're going to have to install emission control equipment, an SCR, and that could be expensive and also operationally challenging. Now, let's say you have two data centers. I'm giving this example to compare having a data center permit in an attainment area versus a non-attainment area. Data center A, both of them have 100 generators. Just for simplicity, say each generator is producing 100 pounds an hour of NOx at full load. And this is probably too high, but just as an example. Now, data center A is in an attainment area, let's say Nebraska. So major source threshold is 250 tons. So they get a limit of 249. Data center B is in a non-attainment area, Northern Virginia. Say the major source threshold is 100 tons per year, and let's say they get a limit of 99. Now, to operate 100 generators at 100 pounds per hour of NOx each, you will get almost 50 hours of runtime per engine for data center A before you hit that limit of 250 tons per year. For data center B, you will only get 20 hours of runtime before you hit that 99 tons per year. These are total runtimes. Now, each generator needs to be tested for readiness 15 minutes a month. That's 3 hours a year. 1 hour of testing, usually quarterly. That's 4 hours per year. They need to be tested on a load bank for 4 hours every year. That's another 4 hours. And there is also building integrity test and campus integrity test and all of those stuff that they need to test the generator for. But let's assume that's not happening. So if our data center B only gets 20 hours of total runtime before it hits the major source threshold, and 11 hours of it is used for maintenance and testing, that basically means that there is only 9 hours per engine left for emergency. And in Northern Virginia, last year, we had between 90 to 100 hours of emergency for some of the data centers. So it's something, definitely the status of the area as attainment or non-attainment impacts the operations of the data centers. To go about it, there are ways to get more hours out of the engine, but this is definitely one of the items to consider. I know, there are a lot of permits where they have just thrown in 200 generators under 100 ton per year limit. And, that basically, that doesn't really give you anything out of your investment because the engines will not be able to run for any emergency purposes. So how do data centers strategize? They definitely have to do some prior research. It's whether the area is in attainment or non-attainment. Is there a possibility for the area to slide into non-attainment? And look into how many hours of emergency runtime they need and when they should plan for SCRs. So those are some of the very important items that data centers need to look at before they start the permitting process and before they start talking to the environmental agency about their permits. Consideration number 2 is Title V. So one item that we talked about was the major source threshold for construction permitting. There is also the major source threshold for operating permits. And typically at 100 tons per year and above, you would get a Title V permit. Now, if the area is in non-attainment, that threshold could be lower. If it's serious non-attainment, that threshold could be 50, or severe non-attainment, it could be 25, whichever one is lower. But at some point, if the facility really wants to go above 100 tons per year, it will need a Title V permit. Generally speaking, for engines, most of the requirements for monitoring and record keeping and testing come from the federal requirements, except there is the semi-annual monitoring report and annual compliance certification that Title V facilities will need to file. So in general, Title V permits are not as impactful on operations as construction permits are. But now in Virginia, and with a lot of data centers that we are getting in this area, Virginia DEQ is now saying that also Title V facilities could be required to undertake air dispersion modeling, even though it's not necessarily part of the regulations. That's the state policy, and that's the recommendation of the data center task force, that large data centers go through modeling. They could also be required to perform fence line monitoring and monitor the emissions coming from the engines at the fence line and the concentrations. I am only aware of one data center that currently does this, and that's the largest data center in Northern Virginia area. But I wanted to note that even for operating permits and even for Title V facilities, there are additional requirements. And the last thing, even though best available control technology analysis and the back analysis and whether a control equipment is needed is typically associated with the major source construction permitting. The state of Virginia is currently saying that if your facility emits more than 100 tons per year and you are a Title V data center, then you're going to have to go through a complete back analysis as well and look at all the facilities across the states, create a database, and come up with a limit for your engines. You cannot just use the presumptive back levels. You have to do a complete air quality and complete control technology analysis. So that's Title V. A couple of other items to consider. One is project aggregation. Data centers usually go into the area, especially co-location data centers that rent space to other companies. They go into an area, they have a little bit of business, but they're not established yet. So they start their data center with 4 or 5 generators. Then after a year, after doing some marketing, they get some customers. They have to immediately expand. They go into another phase of the data center. They install another 20, 30, 40 engines, or go to 100 engines. And then again, another customer comes through and they go into phase 3. So the question is, should these phases be permitted as one project, or are the projects separate? EPA's historical criteria for project aggregation is based on a memo, very famous EPA memo known as Maplewood Memo that came out in 1993, that basically says if you file multiple permit applications within a short time, if you in your funding for phase 1 you also mention phase 2, then the projects should be permitted as one project. There are other factors. You have to look at consumer demand reports and all of those. Now, EPA has a new memo, although adoption is not mandatory, that came out in 2018 and basically says activities 3 years apart are not substantially related. And you could argue that this project is separate from the previous project. Now, when it comes to data centers, I guess the argument about application of funding is fairly easy to make, because they usually, at least the co-location data centers, usually start the new phase when they get a new customer, and then as a result of that new customer, they get some new funding. But at the same time, when that customer comes in, they have to immediately build. So their activities are not necessarily 3 years apart. Their activities just depend on when that customer comes in. Basically why this matters is that if the projects are separate, you could get another 100 tons per year for the new project. If the projects are not, and the projects all are supposed to be, or are required to be permitted as one project, then the limit that you have for the permit just remains the same for all of these generators. Let's look at the case of our data center A and data center B one more time. Our data center A had a major source threshold of 249 tons per limit, or 250 tons per limit. It had a limit of 249 as a result. Data center B had a limit of 100 tons per year and 99 ton per year limit as a result. And if you remember, our data center A had about 50 hours of runtime total for the generators. Data center B only had 20 hours. Now, in the case of data center A, they want to install another phase, and they go to the agency and they argue that this is not related to our previous projects. This is 3 years later, 4 years later. We just got some new business, and as a result, we want to install another 100 engines. The agency reviews the documents and they agree with that analysis. So as a result, there are two separate projects. Now this data center A is getting another 249 for a total permit limit of 498, even though they are in reality, they are separate in 249 tons per year, but let's say 498. Data center B that only had 20 hours per generator, they go and argue their projects are only a year apart, and the projects are not separate. Everything needs to be aggregated. So now they're going to have to install another 100 engines under the same limit. They only got 20 total runtime hours. If they install another 100, then there will be nothing left for emergency. So project aggregation is definitely something to look into very closely. Let's go to source aggregation for a second. So what source aggregation says is that data center A and data center B that are adjacent and contiguous are in reality the same data center if they have the same ownerships and they also have the same SIC code. So in the case of data centers, they are both data centers, and so they have the same SIC codes. If they're adjacent, the only question comes down to ownership. And adjacent is not really defined in the regulation. Previously, there was also a functional interrelatedness component that basically was based on court cases, whether data center A depends on its operations for data center B, whether they share resources, and based on that, EPA would make the decision, or the state agency would make the decision whether the two sources are in fact one or not. There is a recent November of 2019 EPA memo that says functional interrelatedness is not really a factor, and the only factor is, are they, what is the dictionary definition of adjacent? Are they right next to each other, and do they meet the common sense notion of a plant? But again, if you remember that map that I showed about Northern Virginia and how we have 90 data centers pretty close to each other, that is also a very important consideration in permitting. The last one, and this one may not be as important, but I talked about this briefly, that how the regulations and the federal regulations are only designed for one unit or two units and not necessarily hundreds of units in one place. It's something to look into, but it's the NSPS and RICE-NESHAP requirements that basically say you get 100 hours of maintenance and testing per year per generator, and 50 of those hours could be used for non-emergency purposes. If your chiller is not working, you can separate that chiller from the rest of the facility, put it on your generator, run it for a few hours, and find out what's wrong with it. That is pretty much the extent of it. There is also a 1995 EPA memo that says when you permit emergency generators, you can permit them, you can use 500 hours as the basis for their potential to emit. Not very helpful in this case because, you know, if you do that with 400 engines, you will have, you know, thousands of tons of emissions. In accordance with the NSPS, most data centers use certified generators, and certified generators are typically tier 2 for this purpose. And then there are some work practices that data centers are required to comply with as part of the federal requirements. But for the most part, it's up to the states, up to individual states, how to permit the data centers. Hannah, before I go to the next section, are there any questions that you'd like me to address, or should I go into the next section?
No, we're good. You can keep going, Ollie. Thanks.
Okay, sounds good. So let's talk about how different states look at data center permitting and look at this problem of hundreds of engines in one place. And I'll talk about different practices in different states. Many states are now requiring air dispersion modeling to be done as part of the permitting process for a data center. Now, keep in mind, these engines are emergency generators, and they are intermittent sources that would only run for maintenance and testing, say 15 minutes a month or 1 hour every quarter, and then if there is an emergency. And EPA has a policy that exempts intermittent sources from air dispersion modeling for short-term NACs. So that would be 1 hour NO2 or 24-hour PM2.5. This policy is not adopted everywhere, so there are a lot of states that would require emergency generators, at least at data centers, to go through air dispersion modeling for 1 hour NO2 and for 24-hour PM2.5. I have a few examples here. Maricopa County in Arizona is getting a lot of data centers, and also all these other states. But what the state of Washington and also Oregon are doing right now is that they recognize that performing 1 hour NO2 modeling is just extremely difficult for an emergency generator that would only run 15, 20 hours a year if you have to look into the maximum emissions of NOx coming out of that unit. And you also have to look at the worst case wind and meteorological conditions. So as a result, they have adopted statistical methods like Monte Carlo analysis to basically say this worst case emissions that's coming out of this engine do not necessarily align with worst case wind direction or wind speed or met conditions in general. Last time I had a conversation with Virginia DEQ with Mike Kiss about I think it was a year and a half ago at this point. He was certainly showing some interest to using statistical methods to require modeling for data centers in Northern Virginia and in Virginia in general, but also use these statistical methods to make sure that it's fair to everyone. But so it's very possible that Virginia is also joining these other states that I mentioned that require dispersion modeling for a data center. Another regulation that I'll talk about, state specific, is Cleaner Air Oregon. And it is definitely making a lot of noise because it is a very stringent requirement. It is basically a toxics analysis, but it has fairly stringent values for diesel particulate matter. So facilities with that have diesel engines, they have to go through air dispersion modeling and do their risk assessment. And as a result of the risk assessment, they may have to go through public comment, or they may have to install diesel particulate filter and actually control their emissions. Oregon has to review the standards once every 3 years. Next review is in 2021. So it's possible that they make these standards even more stringent. But as far as I know, and in the states that I've worked with, this is currently one of the most stringent requirements in the country as far as toxics analysis goes, because like I said earlier, most states just completely exempt combustion sources. What else? Control technology. I talked about Virginia earlier and how they are currently requiring Title V data centers to go through a complete, full-blown, best available control technology review. Control technology installations in general, oxidation catalyst, diesel particulate filter, or SCRs are becoming more common for different reasons. One, those regulations are coming out. The CAO as a regulation in the state of Oregon or the state policy in Virginia, but also data centers are expanding and are becoming larger and larger. And as a result, like I showed, they may not get enough runtime out of their emergency generators. So they are installing control to be able to get the runtimes that's needed. And then the other thing that I'd say is the SCR usually takes a little bit of time to start, and the startup emissions are being included now in the total emissions, and some states are requiring that various facilities include them. So that information needs to be obtained from the manufacturer. Very complex requirements are becoming more and more common. Some of these complex air permit requirements are coming from air dispersion modeling that, for example, requires that you don't run more than 6 engines or 8 engines or 12 engines at one time. But as you can see from these examples, some of these requirements can get very, very complicated. The one in the state of Virginia that I've talked to the state a few times at this point about is that Virginia requires data centers to keep record of the past 364 days of operation every single day. So there is no grace period. It's not like you can wait 24 hours or a week to keep these records and make sure that they get transferred to your system or to a spreadsheet. It's the way it's written. Basically, at 12:01, you will have to make sure that your records are in place. Now, obviously, the state is not enforcing that you have these records at 12:01, but it's definitely on a daily basis, and every day you have to make sure you have all of these records in place. And I talked about aggregation before, but project and source aggregation, both of them are becoming more scrutinized. There are a few state enforcement cases right now that are currently ongoing. And at some point, depending on the administration, depending on the EPA, there could be that they address these issues specific to the data centers. And it's the state of Virginia is being really smart about this. When you go for an air permit in Virginia for data centers, they ask for two things. One is the 5-year development plan, so to make sure that project aggregation will not be an issue. From the very beginning, they ask facilities how many phases they're going to have and what their grand vision is. It doesn't necessarily, there are many other factors that come into project aggregation analysis. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the facility can be held into that 5-year development plan, but the state requires facilities to submit that as part of the permit application. And also, to address the issue of source aggregation, Virginia is requiring that facilities submit a plan and show the owners of the neighboring lands to make sure that source aggregation does not become a problem. And the last thing on my list, and we can definitely discuss all of these after the presentation, but the last thing on my list here is stack testing. Typically, as I said, all data centers purchase certified engines, and as part of the federal regulations, there are no requirements to test your certified engine. If you buy a certified engine, then that's pretty much it. There is no need for stack testing. But now, a lot of the various states across the country are requiring stack testing for these emergency generators. They do require that facilities obtain the emissions information from the manufacturer, and then they also require facilities to do stack testing and show that these information received from the manufacturer are actually met. Virginia currently requires 10% of the engines to be tested. So for each phase of permitting, if you go in and install, say, 30 engines, 3 of them need to be stack tested. And one thing to keep in mind is, even though all of these engines are certified, the certification is based on EPA's test method for on-road engines, which is a variable load test method. And then when you stack test them at 100% load. So it is basically apples and oranges. You are not necessarily comparing two values that have the same basis. So data centers should make sure to get the emissions information from the manufacturer for that specific engine based on constant load and not variable load. And then during the stack test, they have to prove that they are in compliance with those emissions data. So I think that is all that I have, Hannah. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I'll stop sharing my screen and address the questions if there are any.
I can only unmute myself. Well, first, thank you, Ali. That was a really, really interesting presentation. So now we'll just go into the Q&A session. So I didn't see any questions in the chat window while you were talking, but I guess first I'll open the floor. Oh, Flint has his hand up. So.
I had 4 questions that I put in the chat window.
Oh, really? Maybe I'm just not getting.
So I don't know what's happening with the chat window.
I see. Sorry. You know, I realized there's something happening in the settings. I think, Sunny, you might have to unmute the chat window because it says the meeting chat is muted, and I'm trying to unmute it, and it's not giving me the opportunity. So, Sunny, is that if you can? But anyway,
I will try. Yeah, I will try to see. Can you see it now?
Just let's see.
Okay. So the first question I had is do data centers ever consider putting in solar collectors
So
to sort of offset the load?
Yeah, I actually opened the chat window, Flint, and I'm looking at your question. So I'll go ahead and address the first two together.
Okay,
so
it's just me. Sorry about that.
Most, no worries. Most data centers, at least for large enterprises, they try to use solar cells to generate their own electricity, or at least offset the carbon for the electricity they get from the grid. And most large companies also have a sustainability goal. For example, Microsoft just announced that by 2030, they're not going to use any diesel. So most of them have those kind of sustainability goals as well. But this is all work in progress, to be honest with you. I haven't seen them using, say, batteries or like anything like that currently. Diesel generator right now seems to be the most basically the technology that most of them use.
Okay. You want to just go through the list?
Sure. So what is the basis of the 3-year threshold for separate projects for project aggregation?
Yeah.
That is a good question. I don't know why 3 years. I mean, it's been a while since I read that regulation, but I think they just basically came up with a number.
Okay, because I think 5 years is how often they check for the ozone limits and so forth. So the 5 years sort of makes sense. The 3 years didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I don't know if this is, well, I mean, keep in mind, this is with regard to funding, right? So they want to make sure that your capital expenditure for project 1 is not related to project 2. So they are separating them by 3 years, and they basically say if it's like 5 years apart, that basically means you hadn't planned for project 2. You're not trying to circumvent air permitting or anything like that.
I see what you're saying. Okay, I was thinking it was based on air quality considerations, and that's where the 5 years would come in. Okay.
Yeah, do data centers ever use natural gas emergency generators? I have only seen one so far, and even that one is not permitted yet. But no, for the most part, it's diesel that they use.
Any thought of using the what do you call it, biodiesel?
The biodiesel they could use, sure. And I do believe I've seen like one case where biodiesel was used. So yeah, they can, if they get the diesel generator permit, they can use biodiesel in it as well. But yeah, natural gas, yeah, I've only seen one. And that
the concern I'd have on biodiesel is that it has a shelf life, and that could be an issue for emergency generators. All right, I'll shut up now.
All right, I see a question from Susan. Does efficiency of operation ever enter permitting consideration, i.e. how the computer servers run can affect their energy demand? No, I don't think so. Susan, do you want to talk about the question a little more, maybe explain it a little more? I'm not sure if
I guess my son is a computer scientist, and So he's done work on things like how to make computing more efficient and quicker, and do you do the little jobs first, do you do the big jobs first, and that sort of thing. And I think overall that does have some bearing on how the server farms are run. And what their total energy demand is, but I'm not sure whether that's something that has ever come up in terms of air quality permitting. It might come up if we get into more concerns about climate.
Yeah, that is true. I have not seen that come up in the context of air permitting. I actually do have a very close friend who does the exact same job for Google and makes sure that all of the the data flow is optimized and all of that stuff. But when I had this conversation with him, I almost asked the exact same question, and he basically said no. Like we try to optimize it all the time, but then at the same time, we look at we are all aware of the permit limit and the fuel limit that the facility has, and when we have to hit it. So if they can get a higher limit for the facility, they definitely go for it. If they can do more efficient, if they can optimize the flow of data and use less energy or more energy, then they will just add more server rooms, or just look at it in the context of sustainability and climate.
Thanks. This has been very interesting.
Thank you.
Hannah, you're muted.
Sorry, I was saying that Flint still has his hand up. Wasn't sure if it was a new question or just from before.
No, I just lowered it, I think.
Oh, okay. All right, great.
So I realized that I'd had it up. But yeah.
Well, I had one question just in general, and I was wondering, you talked about Northern Virginia and how many data centers there are, but like you said, it is, and also a non-attainment area. So why Northern Virginia? Do you know?
I know the answer to that one.
Oh, do you?
You do, Flint?
Yeah, there's a major fiber optic trunk line that goes through Sterling. There's like a node for fiber optic trunk lines. It's in Sterling. That's why they all want to be there.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's one of the main reasons. I'll tell you the 3 reasons that I know. So that's one, fiber optic cable and the node that Flint mentioned. That's one. The other thing is actually earthquake. We are not that prone to having earthquakes, and the buildings can be designed much cheaper. And then the third one, it's close to DC, and you have 3 different airports around this area that can bring people in and take them out. So so there is that as well.
And the federal government's a large market too. So.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Any other questions? Well, I guess I had one more. It's somewhat technical question. Just curious about that Monte Carlo analysis that you said some states are doing more statistical methods. It's interesting because, when you think of doing, modeling it, is that something that, people have had to kind of start training on, or, have you seen any projects where people are doing that? Is it, is it the state agencies that are doing it, or, are you having to learn?
No, I mean, we have done one project. I don't think we did a second one, but like I said, it's mostly in Washington and Oregon. So if you do projects in those states, then you're going to have to do it. But yeah, the consultant does it, and it is fairly complicated. So like when we did it, we wrote a Python code to be able to run the results of the modeling 1,000 times through Monte Carlo and all of that. So yeah, it can get pretty complicated there.
Interesting. Cool.
Susan has a question about South Coast.
How do VA requirements compared to South Coast. They are, I mean, I know more about VA than I know about South Coast, but I mean, in general, they are, right now, they're still more lenient for sure. The VA requirements, for the most part right now, have to do with monitoring, and there is no modeling. It's backed analysis is only if you're over 100 tons, which almost the majority of data centers try to stay below. Now, at some point, that's going to change, and a data center that currently has 100 generators will have 300, and then they have to address it. Right now, I would say it's much more lenient. The data center task force, however, is still, you know, still active, and they're coming up with new requirements. So we'll see.
You know, I've done some permitting out in South Coast. Well, not in South, well, some in South Coast, but mostly in San Diego. And there they have the air toxics program, and since diesel's considered an air toxic, I would think that you'd have to do a dispersion model based on the toxicity of the diesel to make sure you don't cause a 1 in a million cancer risk into the neighborhood. And I'm kind of surprised that there's no requirement like that in Virginia. But that's probably coming.
Yeah.
And also, of course, South Coast is extreme non-attainment. So you're already looking at a 10-ton threshold for the major source, new source review. And that makes a huge difference. I had another question about do data centers ever buy offsets? Like, for instance, they could pay for a solar farm someplace in Virginia, for instance, and that could offset their emissions, and that might help them with that new source review threshold and the Title V. Title V, I guess it's still. Well, the new source review threshold.
Yeah, for the new source review, I mean, they have to buy offsets if they trigger new source review. They have to buy offsets and ERCs from the same airshed, and I am only aware of one case so far where that has happened, and data centers had to buy ERCs. But yes, it does happen often.
So it has to be in the same airshed. They're not accepting. It has to
be in the same airshed.
Okay, in Virginia, in California, you can actually get offsets from a neighboring air district.
There are ways to do that, but you have to do some modeling to prove that the parcel of air that's coming from that area has the same effect.
Yes, you do have to do that. That's correct. Yeah.
All right. Well, since I can't see the chat window, are there any other questions that are in the chat that we haven't?
I do not think so. No, the last question there was VA versus South Coast, so I think you're good.
Hi, this is Jim McDonald. How you doing?
Hey, Jim.
Hey, Ali. This was fantastic. I just wanted to say thank you. This was amazing. I'm going to have half of my organization watch the recording. When is it going to be up?
Hopefully in the next couple days. Just to get on our website, it just has to go through our regional group. But yeah, we'll get it on there ASAP. And if you, I don't have access to the chat, but if you drop your email in the chat, I don't know if you're an A&WMA member, or if you'd like, you can join our LinkedIn group for the Baltimore Washington chapter, and I'll post the link on there.
If you place it in the chat, then I'll copy it down and I'll make sure you get you're notified.
Yeah, your email address. That'd be great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I also, if you want to be notified about future meetings, of course, the best way is to join A&WMA. But if you put your email in the chat, I'll try to remember to send you a notice, because I definitely want to get as much participation as we can from the local agencies.
Ali, this is Susan again. Do you know if this has been covered in an EM article?
This has not been covered in an EM article, no.
It seems like a good thing.
She may be asking you to write an article.
Yeah. I was an editor until like a few months ago, but
yeah.
At least until then, I know that it wasn't covered. Yeah. Sure.
We should bring you back.
Sure, Susan.
All right, any last call for questions for Ali?
If I could make an announcement.
Well, yeah, I actually had a couple slides to go over.
Good. All right, go ahead.
Stuff. But I just want to say thank you, Ali. That was a really interesting presentation. And yeah, it was clearly very engaging. We all, had a lot of questions coming out of it. So really interesting. And I'm sure a lot of people will be wanting to see the recording after too, because it was really interesting. So thank you. Thank you for joining.
Sure.
Yeah. So I guess while I still have everyone on here, I wanted to plug our next chapter event, which is going to be about past, present, and future environmental enforcement perspectives from former EPA enforcement attorneys. So we have Julie Domike? Is that right, Susan? Julie Domike and Claire Poffenberger.
Yes.
Yeah, they'll keep saying that. So they'll be joining us to talk about some of their perspectives as former EPA lawyers. So that will be on December 3rd. So please join us then. So as I said before, you can join our LinkedIn group if you want to, see. We'll post. We post things, anytime we have an event coming up in the LinkedIn group. So I'll copy that link. And well, apparently I can't copy things right now, but I'll copy that link into the chat. And also, like Flint said, the best way to find out about our events is to join. So if you're not a member, I strongly encourage it. It's we have a lot of great events. This is just our next local chapter event. So if you have questions about our local chapter, you can contact anyone on our board, and this is all on our website, our board members. So just one last thing is just some upcoming webinars from National A&WMA, and those again you can find them on the A&WMA website, awma.org/webinars. So there's one coming up November 3rd for recycling resiliency and its significance to U.S. supply chains, and then on December 2nd they'll be having implementing EPA's new Clean Air Act policies under NSR and Title V. So those will be pretty interesting things coming up. If you're interested in joining, you can register there. And I think that's it. So thank you, everyone.
One other.
Yeah, go ahead, Flint.
I want to put a plug in for the annual conference. The call for abstract is out, and if you have any questions, go ahead and ask the questions, or you can contact me. I'm the technical program chair this year.
Awesome. Thanks, Flint. All right, Susan, was there anything you wanted to add?
Just to say thank you, Hannah, for all the work you put into organizing this, and thank you, Ali, for a great presentation. It was very informative and well done.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks, Ali, again. All right, well, it was great talking to everyone. Thanks, and hopefully we'll see you at the next meeting.
Yeah, good.
All right, bye.